Hey, folks, and welcome to another evening in my kitchen. And we're on day 4 or week 2, second part. And let's see, I don't have any good music tonight. Sorry about that, but I do have a house full of people, so you may hear some background noise here and there. But that's the real world of my kitchen, right? So here we go. So we're talking about agency and motivation this week, and I'm going to try to be succinct. And let's see if I can do that. I just want to highlight a couple concepts that I think are ultra important. And that's the idea of intrinsic versus extrinsic model, and the integrative instrumental orientations, and then applying that to some context. So that's where we're looking at. So let's start with this intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. Intrinsic is essentially the one where there's no apparent reward except for the activity itself. People are engaging in some activity because they love it, because they want to do it, because it brings them pleasure. And so basically doing it because they want to. And extrinsic is basically you're doing it because somebody else wants you to do it, or there's some other reward that you're getting that's outside of yourself. Or maybe sometimes you're avoiding punishment is another way to that. Sometimes extrinsic motivation sometimes is entailed. And if we look at this nice little infographic on it, intrinsic motivation is things like enjoyment, purpose, growth, curiosity, passion, self-expression, or fun. And that all comes from within you. And extrinsic motivation might be pay raises, bonuses, promotions, benefits, prizes, perks, winning at something if you're competing. Now, the way that this is looking at it right now is that they're completely separate. But there's another slide that I think shows that it's not always easy to completely separate intrinsic and extrinsic. Things like academic achievement and relationships and career success might have a little bit of intrinsic as well as a little bit of extrinsic that are involved with them. So, that clear cut, it's either or doesn't quite work. Sometimes there's overlap or areas in which it's not clear, or there's more than one factor going on. So that's the idea of intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. The other one is instrumental and integrative. And instrumental motivation basically refers to, especially for language learning, it refers to when you are learning something because you want to achieve some kind of objective. You want to be able to do something. You want to get go on and get a better job, things like that. Integrative means more that you're interested in the culture. You want to become a part of that culture. Maybe you're on the outside, you want to become on the inside, or you want to become part of that group, and so you're integrating into that group. So again, it's often looked at as a dichotomy, but sometimes there's a little bit of more overlap in the two. But this is just another slide that shows the two major types of language learning motivation when it comes to instrumental versus integrative. Let's look at how these overlap. And so one way that you can look at it is by thinking about integrative and instrumental might be the purpose for which you're trying to learn a language, and the source of your motivation might be either intrinsic within yourself or extrinsic. So let's look, for example, at this. So integrative, intrinsic might be a learner who wishes to learn the L2 for personal growth and cultural enrichment. And somebody who's integrative extrinsic might be someone else wants you, the learner, to know the language for somehow integrating into the group. Instrumental intrinsic, down in the bottom left, is the learner wishes to learn the L2 for more immediate and practical goals. And then extrinsic instrumental would be some external power. Somebody else wants you, the learner, to learn the L2 for this practical goal or practical purpose. So what I'm going to ask you to do now is to stop the video for a minute or two. See if you can think of an example of that would fit into each of the four squares on this matrix. So for example, something that would fit into integrative intrinsic. Can you think of an example of that? Or something that would fit into instrumental intrinsic, extrinsic. So go ahead and stop, and when you're done, turn the video back on, and I'll give a couple examples and see if they match up sort of with what I'm thinking. Okay, now that you're back, let's take a look at the first quadrant. The learner wishes to learn L2 for personal growth and cultural enrichment. So what's an example of that? Well, for example, someone wants to start a relationship and they fall in love with someone from another country. That is, I sometimes say, what, a lot of people ask me, what's the best way to learn the language? And my kind of silly answer, but I think there's a lot of truth behind it, is, the best way is to fall in love with someone from another country who speaks a different language, or from another place who speaks a different language. And that's would be integrative intrinsic, because you want to, it's a social purpose and you're trying to get to know somebody or get closer to somebody or become part of a group. The second quadrant, extrinsic integrative, what would that be? So for example, maybe parents or grandparents who want their child or grandchild to learn the language of the old country. So I've seen a lot of this in immigrant families, for example, that they they've moved to the U.S. and they don't want their children to completely know nothing about their heritage or their background culture. So they put their kids into a language school after school for learning the heritage language that their parents or the grandparents maybe speak. So next, what's an example of instrumental intrinsic? So an example of that might be, the chance to get a better job. So maybe somebody is living in the U.S. as an immigrant, or living in another country as an immigrant, and they don't have a very good job. Maybe it's a labor job or something like that, and they want to go ahead and try to get a better position that pays more, and they know that they need the language to do that. So that would be intrinsic instrumental. And then the last one, extrinsic instrumental. An example of that might be, for example, somebody who works for a company, and the company's opening up a new office in another country, and they want some of their employees to learn the language of that country, so they send them to a language school and say, here, we need some people that can learn this. And situations like that have happened. My uncle, for example, he was working for a company in Silicon Valley, and they opened up an office in Germany, and he actually ended up having to learn the language just to start to work there, but then he ended up moving and living over there for many years. So that extrinsic instrumental motivation changed over time because his situation changed. So none of these are necessarily fixed forever. They're just places to look at a little bit to get started. Another thing to think about is conditions that increase motivation for students. So not just the types of motivation, but what are some of the things that increase motivation for students? I think this is a really important thing for us as teachers. So there's a nice little list that talks about students thinking of themselves as competent persons, dealing with materials arranged to their level, seeing a goal in their activities, seeing that they see their studies as being significant and important. They're given difficult work, so they're not bored by the work that they're doing. Living in a safe environment. So if we think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you have to have your basic needs met before you can move on to other things like learning a new language. You have to have the chance to express psychological needs for success, recognition, acceptance. You think that the students think the learning is for them, not for their teachers or somebody else. So that's that intrinsic, extrinsic. And so there's a lot of evidence that suggests that intrinsic motivation is much stronger, much more lasting than extrinsic motivation. They work with interesting materials. They have opportunity to make decisions and feel responsibility for participating. So now we're talking about some of the things like agency that's been brought up. So having agency is, Brown and Lee discuss quite a bit that, and that's how that comes into the motivation, is because we know that that feeling of agency is important for people feeling motivated to learn. And the final thing is students experiencing more success than failure. So it's really important that students feel like they're succeeding, and I think positive reinforcement for students is something that works much better. But we'll get into some of that probably a little bit later. So now what I want to do is go ahead and remind you of one of those situations we were looking at earlier, teaching at City College of San Francisco. So if you remember, this is one of the many places I've worked at. When I first graduated, it wasn't my first job. I think it was my third job. One of the things I had to do when I graduated with my MA degree and started teaching in the Bay Area in San Francisco was I had to work multiple jobs. And this is very typical for people that are doing these teaching jobs. And sometimes we call that being a freeway flyer, where you drive from one college to another college. And at one point, I even had 3 jobs. I was driving around the whole Bay Area. I lived in San Francisco, so I was really happy to this was my third job. My City College of San Francisco was down the street from where I lived, so it was really nice to be able to work there. So if you think back to this group, this population that I'm working with, they're immigrants. They're all ages ranging from 20 to 80-year-old sometimes. They were, they're just really, they had all kinds of different jobs. Some of them had no jobs and they had just moved here. And some of them had positions already and they were trying to increase their English. So there's really an interesting group to work with. And so if we apply those models, if we go back to this motivation matrix, what would you say is the where would they fit in? Which quadrant on here would? And again, there might not be this uniform thing within this group, but if we look, say, predominantly, where would they fit in? So go ahead and take a guess at that. And this is where I'm hoping that you suggested. This is where I think that they would fit in as largely intrinsically motivated and integratively motivated. So they're wanting to learn the language because they're living in a new country and they really want to learn, to fit in and to become a part of this new country and culture that they're living in. So if we go back to the conditions, once again, which of these conditions, go ahead and guess, which of these conditions do you think that particular group had for motivation, or me as the teacher could try to make in their class so that they were feeling motivated? So you can take a minute for that. Okay, and so what I have on my list, things that I would try to do is deal with materials arranged to their level, so making sure that I didn't go too high or too low for them. Seeing goals in their activities, making sure that they're given difficult but not too difficult work, thinking that the learning is for them and not for their teachers, working with interesting materials, having opportunities to make decisions and feel responsibility for participating, and experiencing more success than failure. So those are things that I could control. Things like living in a safe environment. I really have no control over that for this group, and I know that some of them were living in very poor sections of San Francisco under very straining conditions. So I'm assuming that it was all over the place, but some people had safe environments and some people did not. I could make the classroom a more safe environment, but I didn't have any control over their home. So that's the City College of San Francisco. But I also, one of my other jobs that I got early on after I graduated was at a very different location. It's at the University of San Francisco, or USF. USF is a private Jesuit college located in the middle of San Francisco. This was also a nice job for me because it was very close to, I didn't have to commute so far to do my teaching out of the back of my car. And the university had a lot of international students. And they also had a requirement there that all students had to take a public speaking course. And what happened is that a lot of the international students at the university struggled in the public speaking courses, and the teachers who taught it were trained in like speech and rhetoric, and they had no idea how you could help people that were second language learners, that for English wasn't their first language. So what they ended up doing is they created a couple of sections that they set aside every semester, because they were on the semester system there, for international students. So they wouldn't have to compete for grades with native speakers, so that they could hire somebody who was trained in working with ESL and with non-English speaking, or they're English speaking, but that's their second language. And so some of those issues that are involved with pronunciation, accent, grammatical issues, phrases, knowing the correct phrases that you use when you're doing a presentation, things like that. So I was lucky and landed that job at one point, and taught that for a number of years. The students were from multiple countries, but there were quite a few from Asia, a lot, and particularly Indonesia. So USF had a strong connection with Indonesia, and so there was a very large contingency of Indonesian students. The other thing I should say is they were often very wealthy students, not always, but some, they were often seen driving very ritzy cars, living in very, they all lived in, I don't know if they all lived in the dorms, but most of them lived in the dorms. They had their, whole food plans were paid for and everything. And some of them told me, I got to hear stories about how many of them back at home had servants, and this was the first time in their lives that they were having to wash their clothes in the laundry by themselves or make their own beds or things like that. So that was kind of the population that I saw there. So now I'd like you to turn to this motivation matrix and pause the video for a second and turn it back on after you've decided which part of the matrix you think that very different context of teaching at USF those students fit in. Okay, so this is what I chose, was extrinsic instrumental. And I'm saying extrinsic because the course is required, and instrumental because they need to do well in the language in order to get a good grade. So that's that kind of immediate need, the very explicit need that they have, and extrinsic because it's coming from outside of them. So if we go back to then this other conditions slide, and we're thinking about what conditions was I able to set up as a teacher, or did I know about that were increasing their motivation. It's largely the same as the other one, but there are a couple of differences. For example, in this case, I was assuming they're living in a safe environment. They may not think that the learning is for them, and they may think it's more for the teachers or the institution in this case, because it's this hurdle that they have to climb through and go through. So it could be a little bit different for that. So now the next thing I'm going to do is just set you up for the task this week. There's a film that I have for the task for the second half of this week. And what your job is to watch that film, and then this again, think about this motivation matrix and the conditions that increase motivation list, and then go ahead and discuss that and any other concepts from the book that you think apply to this context, which is quite different than the contexts that I was giving as examples for CCSF or for USF. So that's it. Hope I was a little bit shorter today. I don't know. I'll have to see when I play it back and start editing it. But have a good rest of your week, and have a good 4th of July too. So one thing I do want to mention is that we have a quiz typically slated on Monday, but Monday is technically a holiday because It's the 4th of July. So what we're going to do next week is we're going to delay the quiz and put that on Tuesday instead of Monday. And we'll have a shorter discussion to do just on Wednesday. So we'll adjust it so that you can actually have that day as a holiday. Because it's scheduled in the scheduled classes. So that's it. Again, as always, if you have questions, don't be shy to email me, let me know, and talk to you sooner or later. See you online.